that I think get at what are the perceptions and why. And I guess I want to start off with the idea that perceptions are contextual, and it's the context that matters. And the context of perceptions in policing, one important context is race, and really the race you occupy. And of course, other things are racialized, like neighborhoods. So I was kind of thinking there's kind of a Rashomon effect, and I always love the Kairys movie. A lot of you know this movie, but 4 people witness a rape and a murder, and 4 people have very, very different interpretations of that event. And it's all based on their perceptions of reality. And so what I wanted to show you in a very brief 8 minutes, what polling data says and how sociologists interpret it. So the first box you see in front of you, actually I wanted to start off with a quote. Our nation is moving towards 2 societies, one white, one black, separate, unequal. I was very young when this came out from the Kerner Commission, but it struck me that things haven't changed that much. That this statement could apply to 2015, which sadly is the case. And if you look at the box, I apologize for making it on the small side. This is right after events in Ferguson, and if you look at the chart there, what you see is perceptions of treatment in the criminal justice system. And a near majority of whites believe that blacks and other minorities are treated equally. And then if you go down to the text at the bottom, or text next to it, percent saying blacks in the community are treated less fairly than whites. This is a survey that was done a few days ago. And the difference is staggering by race. It's simply people living in 2 separate societies. Percent saying blacks in their community are treated less fairly than whites. In dealing with the police, blacks respond at 7%, while whites respond at 37%. In the courts, right, sizable majority of blacks believe they're treated less fairly, where whites, a minority, do. Again, this is 2 worlds that people occupy based on their skin color. So the question that I ask as a researcher is, why are there such different views, right? If they differ by race, then why? How do we explain it? So this is, again, just a very quick thumbnail of an overview, and my colleagues will get into some of the more specifics. But so just to lay out some of the things that I think are going on in the literature. The first one is that for a majority of whites in the United States, they believe that the color line has been erased. That is, the playing field is level. And there's an enormous amount of survey data that supports this. One survey that I like, it's both Gallup and Pew do it, that a majority of white Americans believe that the goals of the civil rights movement have been achieved. We're there. We're in the promised land. And this among white Americans, the perception is even worse than that, because what they say basically is that white and blacks have equal access to education, they have equal access to jobs, that they're not discriminated where they work, so that on every level, conceptually, as whites see it, the playing field has been leveled. And you can see how this is going to start to think about policing. So why such differing views? Well, what do we know from the research? That whites hold stereotypical views of black men. And there's multiple studies, implicit bias, there's just survey literature on stereotypes. And what are the basic stereotypes? Well, the stereotypical view is that black men are prone to violence, and they're deeply involved in criminal behavior involving drugs. Of course, what do we know from NIH? There's great data out there that we know that people do drugs at the same rate. That is, people smoke marijuana, and they're sniffing and snorting and drinking and doing whatever they do at the same rate. So if they're doing drugs at the same rate, all things being equal, we should see people in jail at the same rate. But of course, we know that is not the case, right? So what do we know? So drug use is the same for whites and blacks, but blacks are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested on drug charges. And I live in a white suburb. I live in a first-rung suburb of Philadelphia, Lower Merion. I have someone in high school, my daughter, so I'm hearing all this drug talk now. These kids are doing drugs. I mean, I hate to say it, but these kids in high school, they're sharing Adderall, they're smoking weed before class, they're not policed at all. If the kids in Lower Merion, in Narberth, and Villanova, and Radnor, if the cops treated these kids the way they treat kids in West Philly, North, any basically any neighborhood that's overwhelmingly black, the jails be filled with white kids because they're doing drugs, but they don't police the same way. Right? Moving right along. Because black neighborhoods are perceived as being lawless by whites, broken windows, stop and frisk, 0 tolerance, 3 strikes, and you're out, policing powers become justified in the self-fulfilling prophecy. So we put in place policies 25 years ago where we hyper police, and of course if you hyper police, you're going to find more people, right, you can arrest, and then you say, wow, they are, look, there's so many in jail, they must be criminal, right? But how do you come to know this? This is what, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, Merton talked about, straight and simple. But the idea is that how does it get reinforced? How does it get part of our kind of social understanding of group dynamics? And part of it is the media. There's just no way around it. And I took verbatim from a recent Brookings report about the media. And you can read all this, but it's simply that if you are a Fox viewer, I won't pick on Fox. If you watch Fox, which has an unbelievably right-wing conservative slant, they're going to present racial minorities in a certain way, and it's negative. And if you go all the way from all the way down, and I would argue, as you move towards more objectivity, as objective you can be in the news, you have people have a very different perception, right, of race and crime. I don't have my glasses on. How am I? Oh, I'm perfect. Okay, good. And so one other thing that I'm very interested in is basically I do a lot of work on segregation and how segregation shapes perceptions of reality. So there's a lot of good work that sociologists do on social network analysis. And so what they did was they asked people, more or less, tell me about your social networks, what they call your core networks. And the core networks are basically, right now, who are your 3 best friends? And think about the color that they are. Most people, and this includes everyone, have same race best friends. So imagine here, 75% of all whites in the United States have no friends across the color line. They live in white suburbs primarily. They go to white churches or synagogues or mosques. They live in white worlds. The way that they understand blacks or Latinos or Asians is through television. This is shaping one's consciousness. And I would ask you about Philadelphia. Tell me if you can even name 3 or 4 neighborhoods that have been integrated for 2 decades. Tell me after this, because I don't know any. Finally, on the back, just quickly, what does the research suggest? That blacks have significantly lower levels of confidence in police, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about this. They're seen as less honest. My mother always said to me, I grew up in a Philadelphia neighborhood, Rails community. My mother said, you get in trouble, go to a cop. A lot of parents aren't telling their kids that. Right? I was told that in my neighborhood. 80% of whites believe that something other than discrimination was the reason blacks are overrepresented in prison. Right? And this is a hugely important number. Blacks believe they are treated more harshly by police. And finally, 70% of whites and 50% of blacks see that they need new civil rights laws are needed to reduce discrimination against them. A way of understanding is that whites see the situation as it is as being fine. And this is part of the problem. Thanks, Dr.
Dr. Gallagher has certainly succeeded in stealing a little bit of my joy, so
sorry.
It's okay. So I'll meander around, I guess, a little bit and try to make some sense of what I have here. I consider myself a criminologist, and I like to focus in on a number of issues, including but not limited to drugs and crime, violence, and also theories of crime that revolve around communities. And so, what are some of the, I guess, most relevant issues related to perceptions of policing? There are many, but I guess for the sake of time, I'll just try to focus in on 2 or 3. I would say that order maintenance policing, this particular style of policing, has been particularly problematic in urban communities for some time now. And if I back up a little bit, I just want to tell you about how order maintenance policing became more popular today. So I don't know if some of the CJ and criminology majors have spoken about this, but broken windows policing is essentially a theory that says that, social disorder, basically behaviors that make people feel uncomfortable, like loitering, drinking, things like that, and physical disorder, such as vacant lots, abandoned buildings, and things of that nature, lead to perceptions from criminal offenders or potential criminal offenders that the consequences for engaging in deviant behavior in said place really aren't there. And that eventually this sort of disorder will lead to very, very, very serious crime, right? So the idea is that if we take care of the disorder stuff before it gets out of hand. We don't have to worry about the serious crime later on. It's interesting theoretically, and it makes sense logically, but the research again and again tells us that there's no causal relationship between seeing trash on the street and, you subsequently being, bust upside your head. It just doesn't work out that way. And things are a lot more complex. In spite of that, many law enforcement departments across the country, including the NYPD and to a certain extent the Philadelphia Police Department, has decided to use broken windows as a way of responding to crime. And so the response essentially became what we call order maintenance policing, and that also includes what we refer to as stop and frisk. Now, the issue with stop and frisk is that frequently we find that these are policies that allocate officers a wide range of discretion, right? So I decided to stop this person because he or she engaged in furtive movements. Now, what does that mean? You're walking down the street and suddenly you forgot your purse, so you decided to dart back home. That's a furtive movement. You started moving your hands around in your pockets. That suggests some sort of suspicious behavior. But the reality is, does that really qualify the standard for reasonable suspicion? The other issue is that these policies have focused resources or stop and frisk resources in communities of color, poor communities of color predominantly. And the issue is that some might say, well, is it working? Because if it's working, we don't worry about the fact that we're offending people, which is problematic in and of itself. We'll put that to the side for now. But we know that it's not, right? So the NYPD has engaged in many millions of stops and frisks over the past, I'd say, 10 years or so. And studies have shown that less than 1%, much less than 1%, has resulted in the recovery of some sort of illicit weapon, right? So if it's working, then we would suspect that you stop somebody, you frisk them, and you don't recover a weapon. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And in spite of the fact that we stop people of color much more than we stop whites, we find that searches and frisks of whites are more likely to actually recover a weapon. So these are obviously problematic for clear reasons. I see order maintenance as an example of over-enforcement in many communities, right? So people constantly feel they're under a state of surveillance in spite of the fact that they really aren't guilty per se. What's problematic about this is that it sort of erodes the trust of communities in the police, and it leads to dire consequences. So there's a recent study that showed that in communities where police officers are more likely to engage in order maintenance policing, down the line we would expect crime to actually increase over time, especially violent crime. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that order maintenance policing and these sort of rogue policing tactics lead people to eventually just not trust the police. And so they have to resort to some sort of alternative way of dealing with conflict. Unfortunately, this also leads to more violence. So the process becomes a little bit cyclical. So in this sense, it's not only bad policing, but it's policing that makes neighborhoods inherently more and more dangerous, which is certainly not what we want. In terms of solutions, there are a number of things that I would support in one way or another. So most police departments engage in a recruitment tactic called screening out, right? So you allow a whole bunch of applications coming from across whatever geographic space, and you sort of filter out applications based on whatever your criteria entail. The alternative to that is screening in, which could potentially be a more progressive way of recruiting police officers. So instead of handing potential officers a test that sort of gauges how well they abide by law and order standards, what would happen if we actually attempted to reach out to people who had backgrounds in social work, to people who actually had backgrounds in education, to people who had backgrounds in sociology, right? Instead of looking for these sort of stereotypical law and order individuals who believe that it's necessary to punish our way out of crime, and there's tons and tons of studies that also suggest that just really does not work. I also think it's important that we think about racial diversity in terms of recruiting police officers, but not exclusively for the reasons that we believe. Most individuals would agree that it's important that we have a diverse police department and a police department that is reflective of the community. And there are obvious benefits to that, right, culturally, right, in terms of communication and exchanging information between communities and police departments. But it's also important that we think about, let's see, how can we say this? It's also important that we think about this sociologically, if you will, right? So it's important to have a diverse police department. It's important that we have individuals across the racial and ethnic spectrum have access to civil service employment. But we have to remember that that people of color can engage in white supremacy, that women can sort of adopt patriarchy, that poor people can inherit or that can internalize beliefs of classism. So it's not enough just to say that, well, we have black people policing the black community, or we have Latino people policing the Latino community. It's very important that we sort of recruit people and train police officers in a way that facilitates an understanding of diverse issues across communities instead of this sort of Band-Aid effect of merely saying, let's put those people of color with the other people of color and hope that everything turns out okay. Also important is that I think that all departments should collect and distribute data on coercive police actions. Now, we think this is a very common sense thing, like, well, why wouldn't departments collect these data? Well, hey, don't know. It could be a PR disaster for obvious reasons, as we've seen throughout the media. But we know about these sort of quote-unquote celebrated incidents, or tragic incidents, if you will, where someone actually dies because there's a body produced and you can't really hide a body. But we don't know about other situations where some sort of force has been used, like high-speed chases that lead to collisions, like the use of batons, like how often pepper spray has been used. We just don't know exactly what's going on in the police department. It's sort of acting as a black box. So in order for us to move forward with policy recommendations, it's very important that we're able to collect data about the use of force and how often it's actually used. I also want to highlight the issue of police body cameras, because that's sort of an approach that seems to have given us a lot of renewed hope, right? So if we're able to video record what people are doing, or what police officers are doing, then maybe, hopefully, possibly, we don't have to worry about the excessive use of force. And that may be so, but we also are reminded of certain unfortunate incidents that have taken place here in Philadelphia, where, for example, Lieutenant Josie punched Ada Guzman in the face during the Puerto Rican Day Parade, right? It was all captured on camera, but this officer has been vindicated and he has his job back. Another example, Eric Garner in New York, choked to death, all captured on camera. Those officers, once again, have been vindicated. So it's very important, thank you. It's very important that, we consider the use of police body cameras, but it's important that we also think about what would be the responsible use of them, and how would that actually look? What are the policies that should be involved? And I'll shut up there.
Well, I think it's important to try to understand the community perceptions of the police, to first of all, not accept or limit the inquiry into enforcing laws. Certainly they enforce laws, but for most people, particularly in poor communities, the police are the people and the institution of society that they will meet and they will confront. They're the face and the fist, really, of the whole system. And they wind up enforcing policies that other people usually set, and rely on them to kind of isolate whatever negative responses there are. There's two general categories of policies. There's policing policies that I'll get to in a moment, but there's other social policies. I mean, we underfund our schools. We don't have decent housing in many neighborhoods. There's bad nutrition. The long list is, if you look in most of the areas of the poor areas of North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, particularly Southwest Philadelphia, and compare them to before Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. There's some differences for sure, and the legal embodiment of racism is gone, and that's terrific. There's been some black middle class has formed. That's terrific too, but they're very vulnerable when the economy doesn't go so well. But for the mass of people living there, it does not look all that different in terms of the lack of opportunity, the lack of access to resources that other places and other people enjoy. There's this curious willingness to talk about race in the police category, but really we have a society-wide problem of race. It's just more visible in terms of the police. When you see a white officer killing a black kid, something about race may be going on there, right? It's hard to deny. Whereas generally it's less visible, and these general sort of denials that race is any longer a factor have much more credence than they should. Now, the particular policing policies, Professor Johnson really described broken windows. It's hard to overemphasize right now the effect of that. They're basically telling the police to go beyond enforcing the laws. In other words, The assumption should be if you see somebody on the street or if they're doing something that draws your attention, so what, right? The police aren't supposed to take action then. Under broken windows, well, there might be some little infraction, or he might be selling cigarettes that aren't taxed, like Eric Garner. And so they treat that as if they're apprehending a murderer or a bank robber, right? They go and he complains, what's wrong? Why are you bothering me? I'm just here, You could give a summons very easily for something as minor as selling cigarettes that aren't taxed. There's no reason to restrain and handcuff and take into custody a person suspected of that. So it's all, you could call it over-policing, and it's only directed in certain neighborhoods, right? It's not everywhere, it's not uniform, it's selective. But this now is accepted as the appropriate police practice throughout the country. And so it's a really key issue for pressure to be put on to abandon the broken windows and go back to the notion that we're in a free society. Everybody should be left alone by the police unless they do something that shows they committed a crime. And even then, it should be proportional. The police response should be proportional to what the crime is. Stop and frisk, again, gets at this border between enforcing laws and enforcing order, as you called it, where they don't know that there's anything wrong or that the person has done anything wrong, and yet they're intervening again. Militarization really is the third. We all saw that in Ferguson. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in Philadelphia. The focus becomes control, enforcing order, and with it comes this expectation of obedience. There's nothing in the Constitution or in our laws that says you have to obey the police. Now, I don't advise that you disobey. It can be dangerous, right? We know that. But the assumption of the police, particularly with broken windows and the other things going on, is a kind of hyper-interventionist assumption. And that their job is to make sure they are in control and nothing bad is happening on the streets. That's not their legal mandate by any means. So it's no accident that the perceptions in particularly poor communities and minority communities is often that the police are an occupying army. They patrol through in their cars. They come, armed to the hilt, and they expect to be obeyed like an occupying army would. The other phenomenon related to this that is really somewhat troubling is the police now have formed a political movement. They feel victimized. The restraints, like restraints on leave somebody alone unless they do something bad, that kind of basic restraint, that's seen as a challenge to their authority. How are they going to do their jobs? The mandate they've been given. And so they've organized that people who are concerned about the effects of some of these actions are limiting them and endangering them. And so they feel victimized. Well, there are good reforms around. I think the most positive that has a chance of getting anywhere is usually called community policing. One of the problems is it's got so many variations in what it means. Part of this is because police departments, if they can say they're doing community policing, can get a little extra federal funding. So they kind of label everything they do as community policing. That helps them. So it falls into three categories. There's real community policing methods that I'd like to just mention in a moment. There's communications and transparency. The police should be communicating better. They should be transparent about their policies. The communities involved should be consulted and part of the process to give feedback. And the third is in the general category of attitude, a community policing attitude, which of course would help. It's hard to precisely define or pin that down. The methods of of community policing that I think matter the most are really three elements. An emphasis on foot and bike patrols. You get to know people. You're not cruising through in a car. You get to know the mass of people in the community, not just ones who you suspect of wrongdoing. Secondly is minimal, long-term assignments, a minimum of a year, so that the officer is there for a while and actually gets to know folks. And third is mini stations. Now we did all three of these. The mini stations basically have the police in a sort of toned down, demilitarized mode. In some extent, they're kind of city agents referring people to things half the time. And they interact with the community. Trust is built on both sides. I don't think none of this eliminates the problem, which has that structural problem of the police being the face and the fist of society. But it can go a long way. Philadelphia, we have this strange combination. We have the police commissioner who is known most in the country for community policing, but he hasn't introduced those three factors to any really significant extent. It's just very strange. I was on a panel with him right after they took office. Nutter came in and appointed the commissioner, and he said he's not even in favor of mini stations. And I asked him why not, and he said, the cops just go there and hang out. It'd be a discipline problem, and they just hang out there rather than doing their jobs. Well, in a mini station, part of your job is to hang out there with the community, right? And interact and become part of the community, build trust on both sides. So it seemed a rather narrow response. We should end the broken windows policy, the stop and frisk policy, and the notion that the police are in control and have to be obeyed. That can be done by policies or legislation. We should limit the actions and strategies of the police that lead to use of force and arrest. That should be limited to serious things. Pet peeve of mine, going back doing this work for 30, 40 years, currently if a police officer is even found by a judge, say to have beaten somebody up, used excessive force, or to have conducted a bad search, there might be a civil action. It could be settled, or there could be a jury verdict. None of the fact of any of those things happening goes into that officer's personnel file. And there's no consideration, even though some proceeding has found wrongdoing, at least to some extent, or at least settled wrongdoing, there's no investigation to see whether discipline might be appropriate. I don't mean that it's always necessarily appropriate, but if something like event like that occurs and it's all on the record, there should be, first of all, a note of it in the file of the officer and a consideration of whether discipline is appropriate. There's also things that can be done on the police side. I have to say, if anybody deserves help with stress, it's police. And that affects all of us, right? The more stressed they are, the more in danger many of us are. I've often thought they have a better claim to sabbaticals than us faculty and professors could ever make. They shouldn't have to write a book either. There's also lots of changes that could be pointed out in the complaint procedure and in policy, but those I think are the main ones.
Well, so thank you.